The Drake Group Education Fund is dedicated to educating the public and professionals in our business with fact-based information, featuring the experts in our profession so that we might all do a better job of helping college athletes realize the promise of an educational degree and becoming all they can be as students and athletes, and the athletics administrators who are managing these programs. So we welcome you to our 48th webinar. Thanks to all of our panelists for their time, expertise, and ideas, and to all of you attending today. Webinars provide us with the opportunity to share new ideas, recalibrate our thinking on issues, and get up to date on important topics. We're pleased to have you join us. Before you meet our moderator and panelists, I just want to emphasize our speakers are expressing their own opinions, not the opinions of the organizations in which they are employed or are members, unless they make that distinction in their remarks. Now, I'm honored to introduce the moderator of today's program. Please meet Michael Cavanaugh, a writer and independent researcher who focuses on the affordability issues in Division I college sports at a time of record student loan debt. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Julie, very much. Well, let's begin. When you registered for the webinar, you received most of the biographies, but let me briefly reintroduce our panelists. They are Dr. Ingrid Wicker McCree, former Director of Athletics at North Carolina Central University, Dr. David Ridpath, Professor of Sports Business in the College of Business at Ohio University, Dr. Connie Zotos, Senior Associate at Sports Management Resources and former Director of Athletics at Drew University. Well, three of these panelists are also former college coaches. And Chancellor Nicholas Zepos, who is Chancellor Emeritus and Distinguished Professor of Law and Political Science at Vanderbilt University. Now, we have a very broad topic today. We will be looking at transparency, affordability, subsidization, and sustainability. And each of our panelists have somewhat different aspects that they're going to focus on. So what I think is a good order is that we start with Nick and then go to Connie and then Ingrid and then Dave. So Nick, if you would go ahead, please.
Sure. Thank you for including me, and thanks to the Drake Group for allowing me to be part of this very distinguished panel. It's often said that college athletics is the front porch of the university. It's the most visible, maybe talked about part of the university. If it's the front porch, I always say that the true financials are hidden in a vault somewhere up in the attic. It is very, very hard to get true financial numbers on the costs and the revenue of college athletics. I think the reasons for this are multiple. I think most people realize that other than a small number of programs, most athletic departments lose a lot of money or lose money. I think one reason it's very hard to get true financials is leadership at these institutions often don't want to even show the true cost of college athletics. And so making them obscure or less than transparent is kind of in the interest of leadership. And I've seen this, I would say, firsthand. I think one of the unfortunate offshoots of this is, and I confronted this a lot, is people would say, boy, you must make a lot of money in college athletics. And I was kind of like, well, it's not a business you go into to make money. And so I think with all the TV money sloshing around and all these discussions about NIL and other things and paying the students, I think that there's an impression that the losses are not as significant as they are, or that you're making a lot of money. I would insist that these financial problems are only going to grow significantly from the House settlement, uncapping scholarships and directly paying the athletes for those schools that are covered by the agreement, or those schools that decide to opt into the agreement, which I think might be for the faint of heart. I think those new costs will only put more financial pressures on the universities, and I think lead to even more efforts to perhaps not be totally transparent on the cost of athletics. What do I mean by not being transparent? If you've been in this business for a while, there are a lot of very, very clever ways to hide the true costs of athletics. And people like to talk about all the revenue, but really getting the cost figures down is often a challenge. One of the most common tricks is not to put the cost of scholarships into the athletic budget. And you basically treat all of those as tuition waivers and not follow the accounting standards that generally apply to the rest of the university, which is showing your gross tuition and then your net tuition after discounts. Oftentimes, universities will make interest-free loans. Sometimes those are noted in the financials. Sometimes universities will not charge out the full cost of overhead to the athletic department. So there are a lot of interesting tricks. It's not common to see a university report financials with depreciation, which is a pretty hefty number given the size of the facilities in our college athletic complexes. So there are a variety of ways that the financials can be obscured, hidden, or in fact misleading. I think presidents, why is this necessarily the case? I think presidents and chancellors and various constituents like the branding that comes with college athletics, and a little paradoxically are always into this pays for itself, but never will really say what it costs that it's paying for. So I think university presidents and chancellors like to talk up the halo effect of athletics, but don't really want to show information to key constituencies. Who are those constituencies? I'd say students, faculty, boards, maybe even politicians now, as you see pleas for Congress and you saw activity in state legislatures, more questions perhaps coming from the political realm at all as well. I think trustees in general, I don't want to overgeneralize, but I don't think trustees are good fiduciaries of the athletic budgets. I think there are many trustees that I think could not answer the question, what is the subsidy, what is the true subsidy that your university is paying for athletics, and where does it come from? And so I think board members, and this applies to publics, but it applies to especially to private universities as well, which I think probably subsidize more than the public universities, or in the Power Five at least. But I think trustees in particular um, show very, very little interest. I would say that in my time as chancellor, whether they wanted to hear it or not, I was on a regular cadence where I would do the athletic budgets, and I would do them accurately, and I would do them in a way that showed the true cost of athletics. And I would show the same numbers to the faculty. I don't know what the faculty at various universities see, but I know that I always showed the true numbers to our faculty. I think the solutions here are, maybe several. I think one thing that I think more faculty activism and more athletic initiative and partnership would solve a lot of these problems. So I think the faculty getting true and wanting true numbers, knowing the numbers they're hearing might not be fully accurate. I think there's an irony here in that everyone thinks there's so much money and there's a lot of revenue coming in. This has really led, I think, and full disclosure, I was all in favor of moving money to the student athletes when I was the chancellor. I thought there were gross inequities in the system, but it makes it seem like there's a ton of money sloshing around. And as I said, most athletic departments lose money significantly every year, but we're going to be seeing up to $20 million being paid to the student athletes. Maybe there'll be some true numbers. I think the solution in this area is true collective bargaining. You don't have to call them employees. There are various legislative proposals to exempt them from the employee definition, but recognize collective bargaining. You might get some true numbers that come out in a collective bargaining situation. The other thing is the NCAA. I think the NCAA gets reporting on financials every year, but doesn't have a standardized accounting procedure that accurately reflects the true cost of athletics. And I think they should make all those numbers public, private universities as well as public universities. So I see the costs going up dramatically. I see the shenanigans on the accounting side will probably stay the same or increase. And there may be some pressures that force more transparency from the various groups with the strongest interests in the financials of college athletics.
Thank you, Nick. Connie.
Yes, first, thank you, Nick, very much. And I've worked at every divisional level, and I echo what he said about the trustees and a lack of interest and a desire to really dig down into the budgets. My session is going to dig down a little bit into the budgets. A few housekeeping items before I speak about it is I'm going to be speaking about tiering today. And I think more than 2 decades ago, I wrote a manual on how to construct a tiered athletics program with an eye on gender equity. I do believe that manual is still very, very relevant. And I, of course, don't have the time to talk a lot about it today. I'm going to give you some examples, but it is a free resource. And I will be sending the link to that resource to Rebecca, and she'll be sending that out to you. And if you have any questions at all about that, my email is cez1@nyu.edu. I'm retired and love to speak to everyone about athletics, and would be happy to help you with that. The second link I am going to send to Rebecca is the Drake's Group, the congressional briefing paper they did on the House settlement, the NCAA and House settlement. It's 87 pages long, and everyone in athletics should take a really hard look at that because it really outlines all the financial challenges that could be coming down the pike. My motivation for being here is to ask you to do a deep dive into your budgets through a reevaluation of your tiering models, and a little bit about zero-based budgeting that I'm going to talk about at the end, but just a few lines about that. And my motivation for that is to encourage you not to even think about dropping sports as these financial challenges come your way without at least going through this process. So let's talk about tiering first. Before I do, though, in the congressional briefing paper, I'm looking at numbers of what the estimated average annual settlement is going to be for Division I schools. And I'd like to share those with you. The Power 5 is about $973,913. If this House settlement goes through. Group of 5 is $430,769. These are annual average settlement costs to your Division I institutions. FCS is 282,171, and your Division I AAA is $346,392 annually that you're going to lose in revenue. I believe that a deep dive into your tiering and some zero-based budgeting could make up some of that revenue. So let's talk about tiering for a minute. It's a very complex process. Like Nicholas said about the funding of athletics being obscure, there's been a historical reluctance to ever admit that you are tiering your athletic program. Decades ago, if it was mentioned, it was talked about as a major minor sports model, right? That you had your flagship teams that were treated like kings and queens, and then everybody else. But it was very obvious that most schools run at least a 3 to 4 tier program. I had one Ivy League colleague tell me that they actually articulate 7 tiers. And she said now tier 6 and 7 to a lot of schools would look a lot like a club sport or rec sports. But the student athletes valued the varsity status enough where they were accepting of that. So in this conversation, we may end up testing your tolerance for how far you can tier down, what things you can unfortunately take away from athletes or programs or teams, yet still maintain varsity status. But it's a conversation that needs to be had really across all divisions, but primarily in Division I now. I think Division II and III have been close enough to the vest for a long time that these conversations have been had. So, what is tiering? I'm sure most of you on this call know what it is. As I've said, you're probably operating a tiered model, but basically it's where you take groups of teams and you put them into different buckets. You have your tier 1 sports again, which are your flagship sports. Many schools, that's football, women's basketball, men's basketball, and hopefully a few other women's teams if you're Title IX compliant, because you can't treat 130 football players like kings and only 15 women's basketball players like queens. And they get the royal treatment, and royal treatment is an operative word on each campus. Obviously, the royal treatment at one maybe Division I AAA school is very different than the royal treatment at a Power 4 institution. But you make all those determinations yourself. And then maybe you have a second tier that gets about 75% of the funding that they would normally need to compete. You have different structures of coaches. It's all about funding, direct funding, your budgets, indirect support, and expectations. Your tier 1 teams have higher expectations than your tier 2 teams. And then you have potentially, let's say, a 3-tier model where those teams don't get anywhere near the same level of funding. Again, people have been reluctant to articulate that because they couch it in saying that they don't want athletes to feel like there's a class system. But the reality is every athlete knows what teams get and what they get versus what other teams get. And it's time to get out of the shadows with this. It's time to become much, much more transparent, to let athletes know, to let their parents know that, yes, if we had an open checkbook, we would be providing everything to everybody, but we don't. And this is the type of program that we're going to run. Some of you may have done a great job constructing your tiers already. So a reevaluation of those tiers as your funding challenges to meet your funding challenges are probably in order. Some of you may have a hazy inclination of your tiers. I had an athletic director ask me not too long ago, they had a team make a championship, a conference championship that had never been in that championship. And he had a blanket policy that when it's within a certain amount of miles, you have to go up that day. You couldn't go up the night before, but they were so excited about this one team getting to that championship. He wanted to violate his policy. And I said, well, are you tiered? He said, yeah, well, we don't talk about it, but yeah, we're tiered. I said, and where does your team fit in the tiers? And they said, tier 3? I said, okay. I said, are you prepared to let every tier 3, tier 2, tier 1 team violate that policy when it's their first time making a championship? Because that's what you're looking at. Or are you ready to write a new policy that says that when it's your first time making the championship, then this policy doesn't apply? And he said, yeah, that sounds hard. And I get it. I get how I may have to really rethink that. What I'm asking you to do is to do a deep dive into the tiers that you already have. If they're well-defined, take a hard look. If they're not well-defined, now is the time that you're going to have to do that. So let me give you a couple of examples, because again, it's a complex process. So let's look at a 3-tiered program and let's just look at one place where you can save money, a place that nobody really likes to attack, but that's coaches' appointments and salaries. So your tier 1 teams may have coaches that are the best. You've scoured the earth, you've got the best, they're paid at the very highest levels, they have bonuses, they get all kinds of perquisites, country club membership cars. Your tier 2 coaches are maybe paid at what you would consider the top third of the marketplace. They have a full complement of full-time assistants. Maybe they have 3-year contracts rather than your tier 1 coaches having 5-year contracts. And then you have your tier 3 coaches who maybe only have 1-year contracts. Maybe only the head coach is full-time and they work with volunteers and a couple part-time assistants. And now you're looking to bring some more revenue into your program by cutting some expenses. Are you going to take a few of those teams in tier 2 and move them down into tier 3 when there's coaching attrition or changes in coaches? Or are you going to say to your tier 2 teams, okay, you've had a full complement of full-time assistants, and over time, we're going to have to go with 1 part-time assistant just to recoup some of those funds. I mean, the amount of questions that you have to ask, there's multitudes of ways to find money and move decisions around, move the way you have put your resources into your program around. And the way you do it, I'm giving you coaches employment and compensation, but when you do a tiering system, you look at all 13 elements of the Title IX laundry list, right? So I'm giving you one. Another one would be facilities. You're looking at, maybe your teams have 24/7 access to your facilities. Well, maybe some of those facilities need to be rented now, and they're not going to have that 24/7 access. So how is that going to be determined tier by tier, sport by sport? And of course, facilities budgets alone, maybe you have some deferred capital expenses toward building that locker room between your soccer field and your lacrosse field so that people aren't sharing locker rooms. Maybe that has to be put off a few years. Maybe you have to earn a little bit more money before. Maybe you have to take a little bit money out of those types of budgets. And does that impact your tiering at all? If you look at your academic support systems and training tables, hopefully you're not going to compromise academic support, but maybe the training tables don't have to be extended to every tier. And how about something like team travel? Your conference travel may be set, but what about non-conference games? Or is there going to be a limitation then on conference games? And again, there's 13 elements to your Title IX laundry list. You should have, when you constructed your tiers, looked at all of your practices team by team and decided what kind of support and what kind of expectations you're going to have within each of those tiers. And now you're looking to see if you can adjust some of those decisions to find some money. Let me also say that this can also be a conversation at the conference level. I, as an athletic director, went ballistic when they changed, when our conference voted to go to triple headers in baseball instead of double headers, because it meant more overnight stays. And that was a big expense for our Division III budget. You know, if your conference has done things over the last few years or decades, whatever, that has added to expenses that as a conference you can change, it's a great conversation to have. The other thing besides tiering, that when I've consulted with some athletics programs that I've seen money sitting there unused, is that they don't do zero-based budgeting every year. And I know you become afraid, but let's talk about team travel again. One year your team travel budget may be twice as much as it was the year before, just because there's a flight or more distance, more overnights, whatever. And athletic departments tend to just leave money sitting in these budgets that this year this team doesn't need. And I know there's this fear that, well, if I give the university back that money, or if I add it to this revenue pool, I won't get it back. But you will. If your trustees, if your presence, if your leadership shows that you are trying to save money within a program, and you can divert those travel resources that are sitting in that budget to something else that year, knowing full well they'll need it back the next year. It's an important way to cut some of these deficits that you're going to have. And it's all about transparency. And it goes back to what Nicholas said. Everything in athletics has been this obscure playing the margins and not being transparent. And now it's time to take these deep dives into your budgets and really look for the resources that are there. Thank you.
Connie, thank you. Ingrid?
All right, thank you so very much. Great conversations, and I hope everyone takes advantage of this information and all this wisdom. But I'm going to talk about from a different view, a different lens on an experience that I had as athletic director. I'm not going to provide any solutions per se. However, I do want to just share and pose a question that I think everyone is asking, and the title is Keeping Up with the Joneses. Reflecting upon my 30 years of service at Division II and Division I FCS HBCU institutions, hence some of the schools or the conferences in my background. I'm truly amazed at the resilience and the dedication and commitment that these universities had to their student athletes. I had a phenomenal career serving the constituents in all of these institutions, and I really appreciate the opportunity to have made that positive impact. One of my biggest achievements during my athletic director tenure was leading NCCU's transition from Division II to Division I. And this journey was a roller coaster, ups and downs, twists and turns, but ultimately on August 8th, 2011, we received our final pass from the NCAA and joined the NCAA as a Division I FCS member in the Mid-Eastern Athletic Conference. However, despite these efforts and achievements, the reality of striving to keep up with the Joneses or be like our Division I peers in every aspect of athletics revealed a deeper systemic challenge. When you're in the thick of things, you really don't realize the struggle. You just keep working and striving, and I didn't see it then, but I was just trying to execute the plan and was very optimistic that we could be similar to the Joneses. But at the end of the day, these institutions, and it's particularly our HBCUs, won't catch up because the system is not designed for us to do so. And in today's political climate, the reality is that the Joneses will be empowered to have more and more. And while the schools educating the majority of our student athletes will have less and less, and even a greater fear for our HBCUs who do the work with so much less support than their PWI counterparts. So do our HBCUs and our Division I FCS AAA schools decide to keep up with the Joneses, or do they do something else? So when the campus leaders at NCCU decided to transition to Division I, it was a pivotal time in college athletics. And Division II realized that they needed to answer the question very quickly, who are we as a division? And they did that with the branding Division II with the choice model. And that model emphasized the unique opportunities, the balanced approach for their student athletes, focusing on the premise that Division II student athletes can pursue their academic goals and community service while competing in college athletics. The core principles of personal growth, academic success, and athletic achievement were the focus. And not that the other NCAA divisions don't focus on these principles, but D2 re-emphasize its commitment to providing personalized and inclusive experiences so that its student athletes could thrive on and off the field. Now, this choice model and brand represented balance. So NCCU embarked upon a journey, which leaving, I believe, a true identity as a NCAA Division II school to pursue an identity amongst the Joneses. At that time, I understood NCCU's desire to broaden its geographical landscape for student recruitment and realign its academic profile with FCS level schools. So in 2008, I inherited a program that was moving forward, and my job was to convince our constituents that this was the best path for NCCU and execute our strategic plan. And that we did, but at a cost. And although we realized more revenue through game guarantees, larger conference distributions, NCAA distributions, that black hole called athletic debt kept growing and growing. And I remember rephrasing that term athletic debt to university support during our presentations to the board, just so it wouldn't sound as bad. So as we transitioned to Division I, we quickly realized that college athletics increasingly operates like a business. And this was a hard pill to swallow for our campus leaders, our university leaders, and our alumni, making the transition even more challenging as academic and business operations had to be elevated to meet the needs of a Division I program. We transitioned from a $2.5 million budget to a $12 million budget in 5 years, which was still less than the average Division I FCS budget at that time. We were embarking upon a journey to join more than 300 division colleagues in a landscape of the have-nots. So our transition not only required us to figure out how to handle this new debt, but it brought heightened demands to our student athletes, a more rigorous travel schedule, increased time commitments, greater pressure, less time for student-centered activities. It was a business. And as an FCS Division I HBCU athletics director, this meant that my administrative team and I had to work 10 times harder just to keep pace with our peers, striving to keep up with the Joneses. So the constant question that my colleagues and I at other Division I HBCU schools asked was, well, how are we going to do this? How do we keep up with the Joneses? Where is this money going to come from when the average alumni giving at our institutions was only 10%? And historically, the average endowments at HBCUs are significantly lower than PWIs. And HBCUs receive less state and federal funding compared to their counterparts. So for Division I HBCUs, all of these variables affected their ability to compete at the same level and provide similar resources and opportunities for our students. Yet our student athletes expect nothing less than their peers at PWI schools. We relentlessly strive to provide top-tier coaches, administrators, sports performance staff, academic advisors, marketing, and media relations. All the things that D1 FBS schools, or more specifically, the Power 5 schools, don't necessarily have to worry about. Well, until now. Today, as we wait on the final decision of the House case, all D1 schools are facing mounting pressure to find sustainable ways to finance their athletics programs as student athletes' shared revenue becomes the new norm. Today, for our college athletic leaders, particularly in FCS and AAA, does it still really make sense to try to keep up with the Joneses, especially now that our student athletes have rightfully demanded more time to focus on being students, study abroad, pursue internships, achieve a balanced life physically, mentally, and socially, have more choices through the transfer portal, and gain more financial benefits through NIL and shared revenues? Again, this perspective comes from someone who devoted 14 years as an athletic director, which the majority of that time was helping transition NCCU to Division I. So would I do it all again? Yes. It was the vision of the leadership of the university to make this happen, and we did. We won championships, Our student athletes received conference and national accolades. We provided increased athletic aid and NCAA supplemental aid, and we put NCC on the map on a larger platform through our Division I membership. However, as the tides keep turning daily, dictated by Power 5 member schools or the Joneses, where does everyone else fit? And just yesterday, I was reading about the new proposed governance structure for Division I with the proposed imbalance of decision-making. So where will FCS and AAA fit? Who will they be? And how will they ever keep up with the Joneses? In January 2025, the FCS AD Association, comprised of FCS and AAA administrators, commissioned a project to help establish how they are uniquely different from their Power 5 counterparts and create a roadmap for the future for the majority of Division I schools. So D1 administrators, coaches, faculty, student athletes, and legal experts collaborated with the Pictor Group to develop this model called the Division I Next Generation Educational and Student Athlete Centric Model. And this proposed model is designed to give student athletes a greater voice and control over their experience and to improve the overall educational benefit of their athletic experience. So it'll be fascinating to see if this model sets the standard for FCS and AAA divisions as they navigate and redefine their roles within the ever-changing, chaotic, and politically charged landscape of today's college athletics. As my journey from Division II to Division I was long, I do consider NCCU a success story, particularly as a Division I FCS HBCU program. However, given the challenges and the pressures to share financial resources with student athletes, the challenge of evaluating coaches effectively given the volatility of the transfer portal, and how to navigate the looming financial cuts from state and federal governments. How will the majority of Division I schools that are not the Power 5 survive? So as we continue to see D1 programs reclassify, drop sports, cut positions, they must continue to engage their student athletes, their coaches, their staff, university community, and alumni in conversations to determine whether or not they can keep up with the Joneses.
Ingrid, thank you. Thank you very much. Dave, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Michael. And it's great being on this panel. And Ingrid, it's a really nice segue. And I can answer your question right from the outset. Does it make sense? And the answer is no, it does not make sense. My research is pretty much based on two things that I'm going to talk about today. It's based on other things, but talking about one, how college athletics are ultimately really funded for most. And we've talked a little bit about that today with student fees. On my other screen here, I have just Ohio University. 71% of their athletic budget comes from student fees and institutional subsidies to the tune of about $1,300 per student having to pay that, right? I heard Chancellor Zeppos talk about the front porch theory and this winner take all market of saying we have to be good at athletics to be relevant as a university. That is empirically essentially not proven, especially in today's age of technology. Some of us are old timers. We remember when there was only one college football game on per weekend. It was the Keith Jackson game, 3:30 Eastern time, right? Well, now we can watch hundreds of football games on our phone. Sadly, most of the students here at my institution are fans of that junior institution up north you might know as Ohio State, right? And they can be as close to Ohio State as if they were students at that school now. The draw of Old State U and winning athletic programs is highly, highly overrated. So I do dispute the front porch theory, as I think that it's been essentially misproven many, many times. Because what has happened, I've worked at institutions where we've had great success on a national stage and our enrollment went down. Our fundraising went down, but you never hear about that. You only hear about, oh, guess what? Our applications went up, blah, blah, blah. The other things that we hear to try to say about these intangibles. And what I liked about what Ingrid talked about is I'm here to say that we are the only country in the world that is doing something like this, that essentially about 80% of our sport development in America is grounded in the education system. That doesn't make sense. That's where we need to change. And in my book that came out in 2018 called Alternative Models of Sports Development, and my follow-on book, which will be out next year, called Reclaiming American Sport Development, we have to look at about doing something different because, Ingrid, Michael, Connie, Mike, Nicholas, everybody who's listening, it doesn't make sense and it doesn't work. It is not the have-nots. It is the haves and never will be's. It is the Joneses and the Hatfields, I guess, just to use a name, not want to be mean to any Hatfields out there, just pick the name out of the hat. What I'm saying is that gap is the Grand Canyon, and trying to make the gap 1 foot closer is not going to change anything. Trying to be something you're not is something that we shouldn't be striving for. What we should be looking at is essentially going back what Connie said, not just tiering sports, we need to tier institutions, right? So for instance, if we are going to get to a point of either it's non-employee collective bargaining or paying college athletes, we already are doing that. So we know that that's going to alter the landscape of intercollegiate athletics. Why not have a division, and it could be this Power 5 breakaway, Power 4 breakaway that we've heard about, where they're allowed to do what they want to do. They can pay the employee status, collectively bargain, but to get in there, you have to have a $100 million budget, let's just say, as a baseline, and it cannot be even $1 from an institutional subsidy. I'm just throwing that out as an example. Then you could actually have a promotion relegation system where somebody, if they wanted to be able to move up, they could certainly do that. But I'm here to tell you there is nothing wrong, absolutely nothing wrong with being not a Jones, okay, with not being a have. Championships are championships. All those intangibles that Ingrid spoke of can happen if you're competing at a level you can afford and sustain. You do not have to try to be something you're not. I can tell you that if Ohio University today started playing FCS football, it would not change the makeup at the university one iota. In fact, I think it might make things even more exciting because we could actually compete for a championship. Think about that. A question I tell my students all the time, or I ask my students, excuse me, as I say, who won the 1960 NCAA college football championship? Now, I don't know if anybody can answer that. I'll go ahead and answer it for you. If you were at the Drake Group conference in April, I did the same analogy. But the champions of college football was Ohio University, my employer, one of my alma maters. But it's a trick question. As some of us might remember, probably Michael and Chancellor Zeppos, you might remember, we were divided into two divisions, right? Collegiate and university divisions, or big schools and small schools. Ohio University won the small school championship. We celebrate that championship. We still bring back these players that are thankfully still with us. We celebrate that as if we won the BCS, the college football playoff. It doesn't matter. So what I'm saying is if we want to focus on education, at least in some component of intercollegiate athletics, if that truly is important, taking away the things that you had to go through, Ingrid, the increased travel, the increased budgeting, all those other things, which takes away from what this is supposed to be about. It is supposed to be about education and everything. And when I say we, I just kind of mean the industry in general. Everything we do, and essentially I was part of this too when I worked in the industry, everything we do is the antithesis of the educational and growth experience for the college athlete outside of their athletic endeavors. We are focused more on the here and now of trying to win without focusing on the next 60 to 70 years of the athlete's life. Nothing negative, Ingrid, but North Carolina Central should not go Division I. They don't belong there. Schools in Division I, I can make the argument Ohio University doesn't belong there. However, we could do not just tiering institutions. Why not tier entire sports nationwide? Why not let an institution, we'll take Vanderbilt as an example. Not that they would do it, maybe not a great example, but I wanted to give deference to our former chancellor here. But let's say Vanderbilt says, you know what? We want to compete in FCS football. We want to be Division I in baseball, all these other sports. And then we're going to have another 20 sports that are going to compete in Division II, Some will compete in Division III, and then we'll have a whole bunch, as Connie said, kind of the tier 6 and 7 in the Ivy League that'll compete at the club level. That'll increase enrollment. That'll increase alumni donations. That'll increase opportunities to give us all these intangibles that we've all talked about here today. We can reduce travel, all these other things. Why not let a school like an Ohio University say, these are the 4 or 5 sports while meeting Title IX that we're going to go and treat like kings. The other ones are going to be Division II. It's going to be local regional competition, local regional recruiting. We're going to have some at the Division III level, some sports that are going to be non-scholarship, completely academically oriented. And some of the sports are also going to be club. Why not do that? My whole purpose of the books that I've written and my book that's coming out is that we really need to think outside the box. What I don't hear from the proposed college sports commission or from the commission that Greg Sankey and my athletic director, Julie Cromer, chaired a couple years ago, I've not heard real outside the box innovative solutions to fix this. Number one, why are we the only country that does this? We need to have alternative models of elite development outside of the educational space. And what we do inside the educational space, it's okay if some want it to be a business. It's okay if some want to pay their athletes. It's okay if we essentially even delay that educational opportunity for some athletes. Let them get their education at a later date. Let them have that lifetime opportunity, not just to go back to the school that they played for, say if they played for a Vanderbilt. Why not give them something that I'm calling the athletic GI Bill, that they have the opportunity that they give their time and treasure, we'll say to Vanderbilt University. They're paid employee. They don't go to class. They don't have to. But guess what? You have this account of a lot of money that you have donated to, and it has been matched or tripled, just like the GI Bill. You have thousands upon thousands of dollars. You can go back to the school you played for, or in this case, schools that we see, quite frankly. You can go to a trade school. You can go to graduate school if you've finished your undergraduate degree. You can buy a house, start a business, start a website. All those things we should be looking at as opportunities for our athletes to truly succeed in life for the time and treasure that they've given us. So how I come at this is, I think we focus too much on these traditional ideals. We need to get crazy and really think about some interesting ways to fix college athletics, because I'll close with this. No matter what model we have, if the athletes are paid, if they are coming out with wheelbarrows full of gold, that stadium in Columbus, that football stadium, it is going to be full. We will always watch the games. Why not make a system that works better for the country, works better for the athletes, and gives educational opportunities, but not within this 18 to 22-year-old box, not within this box of where they have to be a full-time enrolled student. There's nothing that says that has to be done. Education is a process. It's done over a spectrum. We're always going to watch the games. Let's do something innovative and really make the system work.
Dave, thank you very much. We do have time for a segment now where the panelists can discuss some of the things that have already been raised. And obviously, Dave has essentially asked some questions to the other panelists and would welcome any comments from them. I would just add to that. So we're talking about perhaps as things are about to evolve pretty quickly, we will be opting in many instances, so that things are quickly going to go even further in the other direction this year. Well, if you can't really afford to opt in based on how much you're already losing on sports, you're going to do it anyway. And does that create a problem? I would throw that into the issues that Dave has raised. And any of you would like to discuss any of this? Connie, I guess you've got. Please go ahead.
Sure. Dave talking about a Vanderbilt having Division III teams, of course, just sent me over the edge. And I understand the concept. Of course, it's not much different than cheering. And I think it can be done, but all I want to say is don't bring the pain down to Division II and Division III that Division I is feeling. A lot of what we do is not broken. Now, having said that, though, could Division I conferences get together and create a set of standards for certain teams that they're going to abide by? They're not going to have any of the teams in this bucket get scholarships. Are they going to have regional travel? Are they going to do, X, Y, and Z? Easy, not easy, complex. I shouldn't say easy, but there are so many alternatives to look at rather than chase the golden ring. And even the tiering conversation that I had was based on making up, those $300,000 deficit you're going to have if the House settlement goes through. It was not to make up chasing the golden ring. That is, an entirely different conversation that needs funding resources, and Ingrid covered that very, very well. So do I think there's alternatives to tier within conferences, within programs? Absolutely. And I think that should be part of the conversation.
One of the things that we haven't talked much about is the pressures on revenues and when TV contracts come up and obviously conference expansion. But one of the things that is interesting, and I've spent some time analyzing, is the entry of private equity into college sports. And I don't know if any of you have looked at that, but some schools have set up models that are friendly to it. So I think an interesting question with the kind of Power Four will be, how far are they willing to go to maybe give up autonomy on their campuses in their programs, or have partners that are from the outside world? So I see, interestingly, private equity coming into the picture. Another way that schools are trying to raise money, University of Texas does this, is basically to have third parties build their facilities and then treat those facilities as kind of never dark. Concerts, rodeos, truck pulls, all of the different events that are happening there. The third thing is, I think we're going to see a trend, and I think it's happening already, but a trend for kind of chief development officers in athletic departments, that we're going to start to see people whose job it is to come up with new ways of producing revenue in the athletic departments. And so I think on the revenue side, people are starting to think out of the box. Most of the programs I've talked to are not comfortable giving up a majority share and control, and there are probably governance issues that are very salient there. But might a program take a large private equity minority partner? So I think on the revenue side, there are people that are thinking outside of the box. The question is, are we comfortable being outside of that box when we're bringing in third parties that maybe have interests that are not aligned with the overall welfare of our student athletes and our campuses?
Would
I
be
think
nice to
that,
see the same innovation, Nick, with managing cost. I think that's the one thing in intercollegiate athletics that we've completely failed at. It's always
Yeah.
increased revenue, but it's rarely, if ever, managed costs. And there's a lot of fat to cut, even where, paying the athletes shouldn't affect anything. There's many things that can be cut before that becomes an issue, or even before sport has to be cut.
And it's getting worse. It's getting worse with the travel. Kids having to travel cross country in some of these conferences now for various games. It's only going to get worse. And then consider, what is the impact on that student athlete schooling?
So one of the things that I think was the fun part of the transition, and I do peer reviews now for the NCAA of schools that are transitioning to Division I, and I always talk to those ADs and their staff about how creative and innovative that's the fun part. So like I give kudos in terms of, we're talking about being creative and generating new revenues, particularly for the SWAC and the MEAC. So kudos to their leadership and ESPN that created the Celebration Bowl. So now and especially with the MEAC, but there's, I think, 6 football schools out of the 8. They have 1 in 6 chances of, realizing $800 to $1 million by making it to the Celebration Bowl. So they gave up their AQ to go to the NCAA Division I FCS, where there's really not a lot of revenue that's generated for those schools to participate for the Celebration Bowl. So being very creative. When you're talking about in expenses, we did have a full-time mental health counselor as in collaboration with our student affairs division. However, we also looked at, okay, what are some other ways that could provide those resources and mental health resources for student athletes? So we partnered with the School of Social Work. So we had graduate students in social work to come over and get their, do their practicum or internship hours to help our student athletes, because that's part of what they're going to be doing when they graduate. And so I do think that one of the things that we do really well with the smaller Division I schools and HBCUs, we have to find creative ways. And I've always been a proponent of that transition from staff members and administrators that go from smaller Division I HBCUs to larger schools. They have so much to offer because, once again, those resources are so limited that you have to think outside the box to create those spaces and those resources for your student athletes.
Thank you. I'd like to mention to people that please, we do have some questions already. Please ask your questions now. I guess the one other issue I'd like to ask the panel to touch on, because you've raised it during the course of the presentations, is the collective bargaining issue. And I would just ask, what's the difference between Ohio State and Texas bargaining with their substantial profits from sports and the over 90% of institutions that lose money and have lost money for the last 75 years, for example? How exactly does collective bargaining in the long term, in terms of sustainability, how does that all work? If any of you'd like to address that.
I think that the collective bargaining issues are really, really interesting. And they're complex, and they overlay a lot with some really powerful moral and legal Title IX issues. But I think that the athlete's perspective is going to be, you raise all of this revenue on our efforts. The coaches got all the money. You're paying all this money to,
Right.
I always joke, I used to want to die and come back as a football coach. Now I just want to die and come back as a coordinator in a SEC school. I think the coordinators made more than I made as chancellor, and I was just telling them I had a better year. But I think their reaction is going to be, Mike, we don't want to hear that you've already blown all your money. We want some of the money, and you're going to have to reallocate within management.
Yeah, I think that's, I agree. Look, I guess, in a perfect world, if we could have this utopian vision of intercollegiate athletics being, about education first and having it be an avocation rather than a vocation, would be fantastic. But in large part, and I think you could even make the argument down in lower divisions, we're doing one simple thing. We're treating college athletes as employees, and that triggers essentially that employer-employee relationship. And until we, and again, when I say the term we, I'm just meaning the industry and people like me that have worked in it, until we stop doing that, and doing things like the Drake Group has long recommended, like, for instance, 1 semester sports, no longer having non-traditional seasons, having a strict 25-hour for all activities, intercollegiate athletics, per week, different academic standards, those things. There is a model out there, or several models, of an academic first entity, if you will, in college athletics, or an academics first, model. But I will tell you, the industry, the TV networks, the fans don't want that. So jump the shark, and we have at least a segment of college athletics that is, I think all of college athletics is a business to an extent, but is essentially is a huge profit-making business that can no longer justify not paying the labor. And even with the House settlement and things that are going to happen, and then the potential restrictions on NILs from the Deloitte Clearinghouse, I think we're only going to see more and more lawsuits, and eventually get to, I think, likely at some level of employee collective bargaining. That's not going to change unless we actually stop treating college athletes as employees, but the industry simply just doesn't want to do that.
Connie, Ingrid, any comments?
Just one of the pieces of the model that the Pictor Group worked with D1 FCS, that was a central feature of this model in terms of the student athletes having more control over their activities. We talked with student athletes to say, okay, with certain activities, study hall, how much time should be controlled by the university or the athletics program versus how much time that they felt. And so that model is honestly, it's based on the primacy of education, not the business model that, we are seeing today. And so we do have some schools that are in conferences that are looking to adopt the model and go by it, but it is very student athlete centric focus in terms of their engagement and the feedback from them about their time and constraints. And so it seems like that kids address collective bargaining to a certain extent, not necessarily all the financial implications, but of their time and commitment.
Do you think
Okay,
that
thanks. Please go ahead, Nick.
I was going to say, do you think that if we did collectively bargain on kind of hours and working conditions, do you think the student athletes would still feel pressured into being in the gym and working out because the coaches have tentacles into those networks? Or would we just totally forbid a kid from coming in the gym, shooting hoops or lifting weights?
Well, I think what it comes down to, Nick, in my view, is everything would be negotiable at that point in time. And as an employee, yeah, there would be those, there's those other consequences of being an employee. But look, athletes are getting fired already. They've been getting fired since I started working college athletics 30 years ago, when scholarships were being canceled, all those other things, right? If we don't want that to happen, we have to stop treating college athletes as employees. And I just saw a question up there, which I saw from my friend Michelle Richardson, is that, college athletes are allowed to unionize. I mean, Dartmouth proved that, at least from a private school level. And I think if public school athletes got together and filed a petition, at least in one state, they probably would be able to do that. I only have a little bit of experience because we just successfully managed to do that as faculty here at Ohio University. So I think we're looking at that. If we keep going down this path, I don't see how we can avoid it. And I don't know if anybody else can convince me that there's any other way, at least, again, like I said, at some segment, maybe if there is that separation that I've talked about. But I also don't think it's the worst thing, right? It protects the athletes more, and we're still going to watch the games. That's the one thing where I've heard consistently, if these things happen, people are not going to watch. If these things happen, college athletics is going to die. It's never been more popular. There's never been more revenue going into the system. I honestly think at the end of the day that fans do not care. So unless that does happen, we could go back to maybe something that the Pictor Group, and I've read that report. There's some really intriguing ideas. I'm citing it heavily in my book, Ingrid. But if we truly want college athletics to be as it's advertised, we should want the Pictor Group to be, that model should start today. But overall, that's not what the industry, the fans, the whole ecosystem wants to happen. So I think we have to adapt to what that is.
I'd like to address the athlete voice issue. We have student athlete committees on campus. They're required on every campus. We have faculty athletics representatives. If those were better functioning organizations that also had a national voice, I mean, with technology, our SACs should be being surveyed on how they feel, what's going right, what's going wrong. We could collect mounds of data, but they are on most campuses not functioning the way they should be. Too many of our faculty athletics representatives are too invested in the program and not looking out for the welfare of the athlete. And they treat their SACs with, a quarterly meeting and kind of what's going on, instead of really being transparent with them and all the big picture items that they need to be considering, listening to them without, to Nick's case, retribution or retaliation from a coach who they know has certain expectations that need to be met. So that's one aspect. I really think that we could design a system of the faculty athletics rep and the SAC that could be incredibly great and collect data and really give athletes a national voice that goes well beyond what they say on their own campuses. That's one. Two, to Nicholas's point about the coach having this ultimate power, this pressure behind the scenes that isn't always right up in your face, but the kids know, that's got to change. And that's a total culture shift. And I will say that our biggest failure has been not having a coaching certification program for coaches. We're the only country in the world, correct me if I'm wrong about this, Dave, because your research
right. You're
looks
right,
at the
Connie.
whole world,
Yeah,
right?
you're right.
That allows anyone who's played for 5 minutes to come in and coach. And they think that clinics do the job. Most of our coaches don't know how to teach. Most of our coaches use motivation techniques that are inappropriate and don't work. They have not had a course in exercise science, care and prevention of athletic injuries, sports psychology, none of it. I needed more to sit in a classroom with stand in front of a classroom with 36 kids in a chair. We have people totally underprepared out there in 101-degree heat on a turf field that really don't know how to teach, that don't understand true motivation, how to relate to kids. And I think in some ways they know that. Not their fault. I am not blaming the coaches. I am blaming the system. And I have rung that bell for 45 years. And to your point, nobody wants to hear it. It would be very easy. It doesn't have to be a whole degree, but it'd be very easy for us to set up universities, maybe 8 regional sites, and create a wonderful coach education model across all sports that could change the culture and the dynamic of letting these coaches go into their universities, have complete power with no oversight, and make athletic directors understand that they have to set the parameters, that they're not just there to get the resources and boundary protect, but there's a cultural element and a taking care of our athletes that needs to be in place.
Can I just say amen? 1000%.
We
Thank
had,
you.
interestingly, Ingrid, I think you mentioned faculty engagement and faculty athletic representatives to the conferences and their engagement. And we had a tradition at Vanderbilt that is no longer the case that I lived by, which I thought was a good one, which is our provost was our FAR.
They are.
And so we decided that the way we were going to kind of put some heft in the room was to have the provost in the FAR meetings. And I remember being the provost, and we had a wonderful commissioner, Mike Slive, come in, and I would ask the questions as FAR that the other FARs were kind of afraid to ask the commissioner. And so I do think that they can be captured, they can be intimidated, they can live in fear of retaliation, and it makes their job very, very hard.
No, absolutely. And I think, with SAC and that Connie mentioned, I mean, I wish it could be that way. I know I see Nancy Hogshead is one of the in the audience, and that going back to the Amateur Sports Act, where, Olympic athletes, national team athletes actually got voting power, until college athletes actually have voting power and a voice in the governance system. SAC is nothing more than advisory and is more window dressing. And I don't mean that as insulting to anybody who's on a student athlete advisory committee or to any faculty athletic representative. You're essentially looked at as someone who they'll pat on the head, say, thank you for your input, now go away. We're going to go ahead and do what we want to do. And I think that is that's sad. And most faculty reps, sadly, are ones who just want to go to the games. Look at it as kind of get tickets. And that's another bad thing. And then you have many that are serving at the pleasure of the president. They're not somebody like the provost or that a faculty committee actually appoints, and that the president just say, hey, the football coach doesn't like you. I've been in those situations as an athletic administrator where coaches would tell me, well, I don't like that faculty rep. He or she doesn't support me, meaning, right, they're not doing what I want. That's problematic. And that's why I think, the governance system doesn't really work. Athletes have to have a true seat at the table. And if they don't have 25% voting on current NCAA committees, at least current and former athletes, or even more so, I don't think the current governance structure works until athletes actually collectively bargain.
Okay, let's, I think we want to move to the some questions as we do for all of our Drake Group sessions. Charles Webb asks to Dave's point, isn't there a movement to allow the so-called non-revenue, also known as Olympic sports, creating regional sub-conferences to lessen travel and costs of D1 teams, even including P4 or Q4 teams?
I know it's been discussed formally, and Ingrid, correct me if I'm wrong, I thought this was even mentioned in the picture report as a possibility. So don't get me wrong, it has been discussed, but I don't see a lot of movement in the sense. When you hear Nick Saban just talking yesterday on the Paul Feinbaum show about he's not so sure if a presidential commission is needed, he's talking about that, passionately about we have to save Olympic sports, we have to save the non-revenue sports, but Nick Saban's not doing anything or saying anything about controlling costs otherwise. That could really help not only save Olympic sports, but even enhance and even add more if they wanted to. It's pretty crazy that a school like Texas, with the biggest athletic budget, only has what I think 18 teams, right?
Yeah.
When you have Division II and Division III teams that have 30 or more, and
30.
I've got to give kudos to Ohio State that they've have maintained 32 or 33 sports and have not gone the Texas way of just really, funding, one or two sports to such a high level where they don't afford anymore. So I do think that it's a great idea. I think it needs to be discussed more, but it's not really, to me, what I would say to you, Charles, it's not really getting any traction. It's going to be a major part of my book, going forward, talking about that is essentially wave the white flag on some sports. Let's talk about how we could actually have Olympic sports, even more Olympic sports, compete on more of a regional level in sub-conferences, and they can still be a great developmental system for our Olympic and national teams.
And I think
think
that's
that
why I mentioned Division II, again, because some of their concepts in practices in terms of, playoffs and regional teams, and that makes sense. And so I'm not sure if it's just, D1, we're Division I, we will not do what Division II is doing, but there's some practical things that Division II does with regards to championships that just makes just plain sense.
I think that we have to view this in a cycle of the power of the four major conferences and the fear of conferences breaking up and the resistance to these regional hubs, which make a lot of sense to me, because I think at the Division I level, particularly with the power conferences, they're so nervous about realignment that anything that starts down a slippery slope of breaking up the conference, I think makes them very, very nervous. I'm not saying I agree with that, but I think what we should probably see out of House and the last several years is really the strength of those four conferences. and particularly the Big Ten and the SEC.
Yeah, a related question that doesn't go exactly to what Nick is referring to, but Donna Lopiano makes the point that in the 1970s, the AIAW toyed with the idea of selection of a division by sport to no avail because a well-resourced larger institution, even moving one or two sports into a Division III non-scholarship division had inherent questions.
Yeah, I think going to what you said, what you said, and I think maybe what you said even makes more sense. I used maybe the separation by school, by sport into a Division I, II, and III model. It really, yeah, it doesn't have to be that way, Connie. I was using it more as an example. I like even more what you said to where, an individual conference or conferences, they could come up with it doesn't have to be Division II or III. Division II or III are established, and why should an Ohio State have Division III sports, right? I can see that. I get that, and it makes a lot of sense too. But why couldn't the Big Ten say these sports are going to compete at this level? They're going to be non-scholarship. Doesn't mean they can't play some Division III sports. We do that anyways. So I think probably, Connie, the way that I put it was not exactly how I wanted to say it. The way you said it makes more sense.
Yeah, and just the basic facilities alone on a campus would give such a recruiting advantage that we can't start meshing your small liberal arts colleges, which is the majority of Division III, with your major research institutions. But yes, I really could see a lot of different models, and I don't think you can wait. If this settlement goes through, this is something that has to start being investigated very, very quickly, I think, because that division between the haves and the have-nots is, as you said, a canyon. And we've got to find a way to, and give it out to schools, because there's going to be a lot of pressure on schools to continue to try to compete, especially in basketball, right? I think everyone understands where the football lines are starting to be drawn, but in basketball, and who knows, the whole selection process in basketball is going to be compromised somewhere down the road. If they're putting tons of money into athletes, are the automatic bids to all these conferences going to hold, or is it going to be a longer playoff, play-in process? So we've really got to start thinking about different models that support competition, yet are reasonable and where people can actually compete and potentially win.
Right. And I think basketball is an interesting sport where, and I've always worked at the mid-major level of where, you get that one budding superstar. I wasn't at Weber State when Damian Lillard played there, but he's an example of, you find that diamond in the rough and you can be a very competitive national team. Whereas then Division I basketball could be governed, by itself. NC Central could still be in Division I for men's and women's basketball, and they could compete. I think they've proven that over the years. And so, but yeah, is it going to be where a sport like basketball, which could be governed by itself, have more of these schools where they could get that big time experience in a sport where they could actually compete in? Or is it going to be kind of like what Nick is saying? And I agree, Nick, it was a great point. We don't want to upset the apple cart in these conferences. So now is the SEC and ACC going to remain the same and then just dominate March Madness? And then all of a sudden it just becomes, hey, a tournament where it's just the haves and the have-nots really don't get in there. I can still remember when I was coaching at Ohio University, the Mid-American Conference got 3 bids to the men's tournament one year. Now it's a 1-bid league, and to me that's shameful. Let's open it up and really make it. I think Division I basketball, men's and women's, could actually succeed, and some teams could be very good. Baseball is another one where there are some lower resource schools in softball that can really succeed at a high level. So that's where my sport by sport, model comes in.
Yeah, and I mean, you see schools like Hobart competed very well in Division I lacrosse, for a very long time. So we've seen some multi-divisional playing up, and I'm fine if you want to play up. It's just you have to be very careful if you're going to start playing down into Division II and Division III.
Okay, let's go to next question. And by the way, Johns Hopkins is pretty good at D1 lacrosse.
Exactly right.
D3 on everything else. But Rick Eckstein asks, do you think the NCA should and would mandate that every FAR must be selected by an independent faculty government body and have full access to athletic financial data.
But Nick, that's probably one for you.
Yeah, I think it'd be a great idea. And I think you could even try it at the conference level on the financial data. Listen, I think everyone should see the financial data. I think there should be, I think there should be, kind of gap accounting, full costs loaded in to athletic budgets, and I think everyone should see them. I think there's not the sort of transparency and informed decision making, and chancellors and presidents are making major budget allocations without being held accountable. So I would like to see the conferences or the NCAA turn that power over to an independent faculty body, but I think the numbers should be available to everybody.
Also,
Right. And I was just going to say that I think the faculty rep should not serve at the pleasure of the president, and no disrespect, Nick, but most chancellors and presidents would be pressured by their athletic director and coaches
I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
I saw it firsthand.
Yeah.
Well,
Sorry, I interrupted you.
that,
Sorry about that.
fine. I also think that term limits are very important. Some schools have term limits for their FAR, most don't. And so I think that's very, very important too, just as much as how they are selected. But term limits are increasingly, especially some of the work that I've seen and done, that's very important.
I would agree. I think there's in regulatory analysis, we talk about capture of the administrative agency by special interest groups. And I think FARs, particularly those serving a long time, can be captured by the athletic program and go from independent steward to vocal advocate.
Thanks.
I think sharing financial data is very important, but I think part of that has got to be a concerted effort to also show people what athletics brings to your institution. It's not always money, right? But sometimes it is. I know at a lot of Division III institutions, having people on campus, those are the largest amounts of returning alumni they'll ever have. Of course, there's also enrollment issues. Without those teams, how is it impacting enrollment? I'm sure that every campus has a story they can tell about what their athletics department brings that isn't obvious and isn't out there. And I have found that most athletic directors don't do a great job in telling that story. And when you tell that story and then say, oh yeah, and we're the biggest budget on campus and we spend a lot of money, sometimes it makes it palatable.
Every board meeting in my 14 years, 4 times a year, sometimes 5, I had to present to the board. And every single time I was very transparent with the numbers because it was very important as we moved from 2.5 million. I think the most was maybe 14 or 15 at one given year, but it was very important that they understood where we were going, what we need. And so they decided that, well, we need to know what is that hole? What is it what's the gap that you need? And so we quantified the value of our athletics program. And we took every single student athletes who were on full scholarship, who were on partial, who were on $0. Right. And we calculated that all up. We calculated how much that they were paying out of pockets. And so that number was the number that we needed was 3.5 each year. No matter what we did, we needed 3.5 million. Well, when I added it up and presented to them and said, well, but we're generating 3.2 million out of pocket of our student athletes, whether that's, from the partials and the non-scholarship athletes. And I remember the chair saying, well, if you need 3.5, but you're generating 3.2, that's almost a wash. And I said, yes. And we didn't even include the state appropriations that the university received for each in-state student athlete, because it was just that whole algorithm was just too much because you get more for STEM students and less for others. So had we included that, it would have exceeded the 3.5 million probably that we were going to ask for each year in the university budget. So you're right. A lot of athletic directors do not quantify the value of their athletics program. And so therefore it's seen as, well, it's such a drain on the university. Well, in average is about 6% maybe of the university's total budget across Division I FCS. So you have to be able to know how to, the numbers do what you want them to do, but you have to be able to show and how it can be an advantage when you are quantifying the value of athletics.
Listen,
Yeah. Now
Thank
with
you.
the-
Let's,
with the transfer-
Connie, let me
Go back to the
just,
front. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just gonna, if we can fit in, apparently we cannot run over. So just to fit in the last 2 minutes, Sanford Thatcher asks, how will decisions be influenced by vast differences in facility costs, say comparing the costs of a wrestling mat and a swimming pool?
Yeah, we actually, when we added sports, we looked very, very closely at the capital expenditures required for the different sports. And just to also say, I loved, when we would win a game and it brought a lot of luster to the university. We beat Alabama in football this year, and we won a Nobel Prize. And the Alabama thing, I think, was a bigger news item. So it does bring things. It's just, if you're putting 50, 60, 70 million dollars a year, as some schools are, that's a big nut. But facilities costs are a big issue. Facilities costs are a big issue.
And also, I think facilities, you have to be really, really smart about what kind of revenue you can bring in with your facilities. It should not, in most instances, be a single-use facility. And there's a lot that you can do in rentals. Our swim lesson program used to bring in lots of money into our swimming pool. I'm not sure wrestling mat's going to do that. Did it cover the costs? Maybe not all of them, but it sure offset them in ways that made it, again, more palatable, more reasonable.
Okay. All right. Well, we're coming to the close of this session. I want to thank the panelists very much for all their contribution. This was quite a lively and interesting discussion. And with that, I think Becca, we will close and end the webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy.
Bye-bye.